Yes, so my name's Helen Aveyard, and my interest in this group is I run the professional doctorate in nursing and midwifery at the School of Nursing and Midwifery, and I also recently this year got the principal fellow for the Higher Education Academy, and but I'm generally interested in all things education, PhD. So when Louise mentioned this group, it sort of sparked my interest, and so I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you very much, Kat, for being willing to present this morning. So over to you.
Thanks, Helen. So I'll share my screen and hope that works. I just came in from another meeting, so this is okay. I assume I can see that. Yes, yes, you can. And I will put on a slideshow and hope you can still see it. Yes, you can, I think. Okay. Thank you, Nick. Thank you very much. So yeah, today I'll just talk about my PhD, which I finished recently at Coventry University. And it was about the impact of feedback on undergraduate students, and then also the impact of my PhD on me. So a bit of background. I am a researcher at Brooks, and I basically went down to part-time to do this full-time PhD at Coventry. And so I'll talk a little bit more about the circumstances around that. And then also I'll talk a bit about my actual study in reverse order. So PhD first. So this is the general design of my PhD. The research question was, one moment, let me just try and see if I can get rid of the thingy. No, I cannot. Okay, right. So yeah, this I can kind of summarize as my PhD really. The research question was, what is the relationship between written feedback characteristics, student characteristics, and feedback impact in UK undergraduate students? And so what I set out to do with this study, which was a bit different from research thus to date, is that I identified a kind of granular characterization, both for feedback comments as well as feedback impact, because I noticed that in a feedback literature, they tend to look at things in quite a broad way. And so my PhD focused on sort of seeing if there were any systematic patterns going on at feedback comment level. And so, for example, the feedback characterization essentially identified four attributes of feedback. So there's function, focus, specificity, and aspect. And so function is sort of like the genre of the comment, and there were kind of qualitatively distinct categories. So there's like praise, critique, advice, and so on. Focus, and this is kind of based on Hassie and Simperley's 2007 paper, is sort of to do with the levels of feedback where it's kind of aimed at. So, for example, a self-feedback comment is a comment about the student, like, good work. Task is about the assessment, the assignment itself. Process would be a comment that relates to kind of generalizable processes. And then self-regulation is to do with kind of independent learning strategies. As you may imagine, these are relatively rare in written summative feedback. And then we have specificity, which kind of just relates to whether or not the feedback itself was kind of vague or specific, general or specific. And then aspect is about whether the comment was to do with the present assignment or future work. And so this was the characterization of feedback that I used, heavily influenced by a model of feedback that some corpus linguists came up with that happened to be my supervisors, Sean Alsop and Sheena Gardner at Coventry University. And then I also came up with a characterization of feedback impact. And so this was kind of relatively simpler. It essentially identified some dimensions of feedback impact. So there's emotional impact and then academic impact. And academic impact was also, it was further disambiguated into four subdimensions. So there's understanding. In other words, did the student understand the feedback comment? How did they interpret it? There's present and future applications. In other words, what applications of their feedback could they identify? Present applications being applications for that same assignment. If they could like redo it again, what would they do differently? And then future applications relates to any applications for future context, whether it's for another assignment or perhaps for their careers in the future. And then self-regulation. In other words, how did this feedback comment impact their self-regulation behavior? So this is to do with their kind of independent learning strategies, maybe the way they approach their future assignments, stuff like that. And then I also put in student characteristics in the study design, though for various reasons, I didn't really investigate this to the extent that I wanted to. But anyway, so these were just like the kind of very basic characteristics, with the motivation behind them being that they are kind of information that universities tend to already have on students, which makes it easy to, sort of kind of get practical recommendations for the university. But anyway, I didn't manage to investigate that to the full extent. But so these are a couple of examples to sort of illustrate the feedback characterization. So something like, you demonstrated a good understanding of the literature, that would be characterized as a praise comment that had a task focus because it was about that specific assignment. It would be general because, it says good understanding, but it's kind of not really precise what that means. And then present because it's about that same assignment. And then this comment, in future, keep your sentences simple and to the point. So this would be characterized as advice, process, because it's about essentially, structuring your sentence, about writing, specific, and future, because it is quite explicitly about future work. There's also is kind of a coding scheme that I use, but we don't really have to pay too much attention. It's just it's like a shorthand to refer to these combinations of the feedback attributes really quickly. So this is essentially how I characterize feedback in the study. And I will talk through now one kind of key finding that was kind of, had various it was sort of an overarching finding of the study itself, because I did two phases. First, I did a bunch of interviews, and then I did a questionnaire. And so this is a finding that relates to the interview, which I think nicely summarizes one of the main things I found in the study, which was that students don't necessarily pay attention actually to their feedback information. In other words, they're not really looking at the content of their feedback comments. And so this table shows the responses from the same one interview participant. And it's interesting because it compares her response essentially to a vague praise comment and a similarly vague but slightly more detailed critiquing comment. So the praising comment was good point. And the critiquing comment was links well with the previous sections, perhaps neglected to link up all elements. And so if we compare, so essentially I asked the participant, I'll just kind of explain a bit about what I did in the interviews, which was I got participants to send me assignments that had been marked. And from their assignments, I picked out 10 feedback comments, characterized them, and then characterized them based on my characterization. And then I asked the participants various questions for each feedback comment about the impacts of that comment. So, and that the questions were aligned with my characterization of feedback impact. So for example, I asked them, reading this comment, how did it make you feel? What present and future applications can you identify from this comment, and so on. And so in response to these two comments, we can see the interview participant has quite a different way that she approaches them. So if we compare just the top two responses here. And so she says to the praising comment, I'm not really sure which point they were specifically talking about, so I'm just judging that section as a whole. And then we compare that to this this response. I feel a bit confused as I'm not really sure what my teacher was specifically talking about. I'm not sure which parts were neglected. And so you can see that the ambiguity of the praise feedback comment was quickly resolved by the participant, right? However, no such resolution occurred or was even attempted for this kind of critiquing feedback comment. Here she says, I don't really know, but I'm just going to go with it. Let's say it's this section as a whole. This one, she says, well, I don't know what she's talking about. Well, I don't know what my teacher's talking about. So that was an interesting contrast, even though this is noticeably more vague than this feedback comment. And then now we compare the second responses here at the bottom of the table. So for this one, I asked basically what things would you do differently in future assignments based on this comment? And so to this, the participant responds, I expanded my answers just to make sure that I continue on with the good feedback, like adding more detail to my answers. And then when I ask her the same thing for the critiquing comment, she says, I've done things differently, such as making sure I fully understand the brief and also asking the tutor for specific details so I'm not left clueless. And so we can see there's a contrast here where with with this kind of application that she identifies, there's a kind of real dependence on the tutor for giving her clarification. So it's kind of quite reliant on the tutor. But if we look at this one, it's about kind of her independent learning strategies. And so you can see that there's a level of independence and self-regulation that we see here that's totally missing from here, basically. And so overall, this example suggests that when identifying applications of their feedback, actually students are not necessarily paying attention to the contents of their feedback, but rather they are thinking about their experiences, their memories of doing their assignment. And so this is an interesting example because, first of all, it highlights that assignment experiences are actually a good source of information for students, and they can use this to evaluate their work, evaluate their learning strategies. They can use this as a kind of as a complementary source of information alongside their feedback comments. But the other thing that this example highlights is that students may not be using the information in their written feedback to its full potential. In other words, there is more learning value that they could be extracting from their written feedback. There's kind of untapped potential there. And this general finding was also, it kind of, appeared at various points throughout my entire study, even in the questionnaires. So yeah, this was perhaps the most interesting thing. And I think this was something that I could tease out because I looked at very granular detail, kind of comparing what sort of learning the students could extract from their feedback comments alongside the feedback comments itself, and being able to basically look at where there were gaps in, the content of the comment and what students could derive from that comment, which is something that I noticed didn't really happen in feedback research. But yeah, so that's a sort of key finding. And then I'll move on to a key recommendation from my study, which quite simply is to use the characterizations that I developed in the study as a kind of almost like a vocabulary of feedback to enable both staff and students to be deliberate about their feedback provision and for students to be deliberate about how they want to engage with feedback. So, for example, staff could, decide, okay, maybe I'll give more process and self-regulation feedback rather than mainly task feedback, which my study and previous research has found this tends to be the focus of feedback that teachers give. It's lots of task feedback, not so much the other stuff. Or, staff might decide, okay, I'm going to give a balanced mix of both present and future comments. And I would note that there's quite a lot of hedging here in that it's not a sort of rule-based thing. It's not that you must give 100% self-regulation feedback, but it's more so for staff to be able to consciously use their judgments to give what would be kind of the best feedback given their goals in terms of what they would want students to be able to do with their feedback. And so this characterization gives you essentially the vocabulary to make these decisions more easily, I suppose. And, similarly for students, they could decide, okay, I'll pick 3 praise and 3 critiquing comments. For each one, I'll identify a present application and a corresponding future application. In other words, I look at my comments, I'll decide what I can change about this particular assignment. And then based off of that, I'll work out what I can then be doing differently for the future. Or for example, they might say, for each assignment, I'll decide to identify 1 or 2 things I can do to improve how I approach my learning. In other words, I will decide to identify some future applications with a self-regulation focus. So I suppose in general, these characterizations give you a vocabulary to make these sorts of decisions around, which really helps because language helps make things more precise in our heads. If we have the words to use it with, then we can sort of think about that in kind of clearer terms. So this is a key recommendation to arise from my study. So that's kind of my the research itself. I will now move on to talk about my overall PhD experience, and I kind of designed this part because I noticed that there were quite a lot of PhD students actually in the network, and also the stuff to do around about sort of recruiting student participants, which I think a lot of us may have to do at some point if we're interested in education research. So I'll talk first about what worked for me and what didn't work for recruiting my student participants, and they were all undergraduate students at Coventry University. What really didn't work for me was posting digital and physical ads on shared spaces. So there's online portals or maybe physical notice boards around the campus. This basically netted me zero participants. And I do wonder if it's because it's competing with lots of other adverts for attention. And also, maybe, you can't really expect students to stop and look at the notice boards. As indeed, when I was there putting up my ads, students were just ignoring the ads on the walls. So I do wonder if it's just not an effective way to do it. Weirdly, the thing that I thought would be effective but actually wasn't was I emailed student societies asking them to share my research ad with their members. I didn't get any response, and I seem also not to get any signups after I did this emailing. I wonder if the inboxes were not monitored. I wonder also if this was perhaps unique to Coventry. I've kind of put this point in there in case there are people who hadn't considered doing this, and it might work quite well for them because it's like sort of why it should have worked really. I'm not really sure why it didn't. But anyway, moving on to a more positive note, what did work quite well actually was I sought the help from facilities managers who put my ad up in toilet cubicles. I did not ask them to do this. One of the facilities managers had the very good idea to do this, and she just did it on my behalf. And that actually worked really well because I think it was a captive audience. They're just staring at this poster. I'm not sure if you could send an email to a facilities manager saying, hey, please put my ad up in the toilets, but this is an idea for you. If you can find a way to get this, recruitment avenue, this worked very well for me. And the other thing that worked extremely well actually was actually going into classrooms, either at the start or the end of teaching sessions to invite students to participate. So I didn't sit there and wait for students to look at my ad. I brought the ad to them, and this worked quite well. When I was in the classrooms, I highlighted the benefits to participants for participating. Particularly, I talked about this being a chance for them to essentially reflect on their own feedback engagement, which could lead them to think about how they might be able to make more use of the feedback information they were getting. I also highlighted that there were five £50 vouchers to be won. I don't know which one was more effective, if perhaps there was a combination of both. But anyway, so this was a thing that worked quite well for me, and I would suggest it also to people who are trying to recruit student participants. And I will end the presentation now by talking briefly about the particular context that I did my PhD in case somebody is sort of planning to do it, although I'm not really sure if someone is attending or watching who is not yet on a PhD. But anyway, so what I did, as I said at the start, was I did a full-time PhD crammed into part-time hours because I also worked part-time as a researcher throughout my PhD, apart from at the end where I took a few weeks off to essentially write up my thesis. So why this option was suitable for me, I knew going into it that the PhD would be very similar to the kind of research that I did already at work. So I knew what methods were available, I knew what the sector was interested in. I had a good idea of the research that was there already. And so I essentially came into my PhD with my project fully formed, which I know is quite unusual, but I think it played a big part in enabling me to basically do this PhD in part-time hours. Also, it helped that the project parameters were predefined by the funders. So this was a funded studentship, and the funders knew they wanted a mixed methods study, and they knew that they wanted to investigate the relationship between feedback characteristics, student characteristics, and feedback impact. So I kind of had this already given to me, if you like. So that was also helped with not spending 1 year working out what it is I wanted to do. I just kind of came in and I knew what I wanted to do. The downside to doing it this way, while actually it was a very efficient way of getting a PhD, I found that there was not much breathing room for either thing. Moving down from full-time to part-time at Brooks, it meant that I didn't really have the capacity to take on like huge projects anymore. And so I think that kind of impacted also what I was able to do at work. And with my PhD, I didn't really get the kind of PhD student experience, even though I was a full-time PhD student. I think partly also this was because I didn't live in Coventry. My PhD was at Coventry. So I didn't really have the opportunity to spend a lot of time with my fellow PhD students. I didn't really go to lots of events. I went to some, but not a lot. And so I found that actually there was a less rich engagement with both things. But perhaps this is a trade-off if you want to get a PhD part-time in 3 years. It was fine for me, actually. It wasn't like, I wasn't super stressed when I was doing it. They were, it kind of ebbed and flowed. But yeah, so if you're considering doing a PhD like this, these are some things to consider, I suppose. And I suppose generally what the experience taught me, which had lots of carry on lessons into my work, was essentially to do with juggling tasks and knowing how I could work effectively. I refined my understanding of what conditions enable me to work effectively. So, for example, I learned to schedule very kind of cognitively intensive tasks for earlier in the day when I tend to be more fresh. And then creative tasks I tended to put in the afternoon because it was easier for me to be engaged and to concentrate if it was a creative task that just, kind of less sort of effort to pay attention. I also made strategic changes to my environment. So, for example, I noticed that putting on music helped me to extend how long I could bear to sit at my desk and work. It did mean a hit in my concentration, but for some tasks, the hit in concentration was a good trade-off for being able to work another hour or two. So there are these things that I noticed about myself that I think was very helpful. And maybe it's helpful for me to point that out to people to think more consciously about actually what helps them to work effectively and then to sort of strategically use that information. I also kind of developed my own note-taking system where I made lots of notes for myself about what I had just finished doing and what I should do next when I'm back at my desk. And this helped with going between Brooks and my PhD because, there would be a string of like 3 or 4 days where I would not be thinking about my PhD and suddenly I would need to think about it again. And similarly for Brooks. And so making notes for myself was, enabled me to really just like kind of jump back in. I wasted no time wondering, oh, what was it that I was doing last week? I just was able to just jump right back in. And also, I think importantly, it taught me the benefit of taking a sustained break from a piece of work. You kind of think, how could I possibly be progressing on a task if I am not working on it? But actually, if you take a break and you come back to it, you're fresh. Perhaps, when before you were worried about details, now you can kind of see the big picture. That really helps with progressing on a task, I thought. And so this is not something to be, or rather, it was quite an important thing that I learned actually, which I find it hard to believe, but it is true. You take a break, you do progress. So yeah, that's all for me. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing my screen now when I figure out how to do that. There you
go. Thank you very much, Kat. That was really interesting. Looks like we've got some questions, but can I start off with a question? So how did you do your analysis? If you summarize it in briefly, not line by line, but what was your approach to analysis?
Yes, that's a tricky question because there were 2 phases, and you said not line by line, but I in fact did line by line thematic analysis. Yeah, so I'll talk. I guess I'll talk first about the interviewers. That's the finding that I shared. I looked to see whether the feedback characteristics matched up with the responses that people were giving me. So, for example, I looked to see whether the focus of the feedback comment matched with the focus of the feedback impact that students were telling me. Sorry, I'll sort of try and explain this better. So the focus being like self, task, process, and self-regulation. And so I thought, okay, it makes sense that if a feedback comment was about the task, the application that the student would be able to identify would also be about the task. And in fact, I found there was no relationship whatsoever. And that was because students were not actually responding to the contents of the feedback. They were thinking about it in terms of their in terms of their assessment experiences. And that's what led me to that finding that the students weren't actually paying attention. But yeah, so to go back to to answer your question in a more straightforward way, the interviews, I had 5 participants, not a huge amount. So it wasn't like there was no predetermined method that I used. It was just more seeing what matched up, doing, kind of seeing what themes appeared in participants' comments and characterizing it in terms of my framework, my characterizations, and seeing if that matched. For the questionnaire, there was an assortment of different kinds of questions. Um, and so there were things like um, I asked them to rank, for example, it was sort of bog standard statistics that I used, um, where, for example, I asked them to rank how positive or negative their emotional reactions were to kind of overall their kind of the praising comments that they received that semester and the critiquing comments. So for that one, um, I just used the non-parametric version of a what would it have been? Anyway, it's sort of basic stat stuff. Essentially, I don't have the terms on me at the minute, and I'm a bit embarrassed to say that I can't remember what specific test you would use in that situation. But anyway, it's nothing fancy. The original design, I wanted to do a very complicated multi-level regression analysis. I did not get the numbers close to the numbers that I needed for that. But that was the plan. But anyway, yeah. So
Mm.
that was
D-
roughly.
d-
I don't know if that kind
Oh,
of answers your question,
no,
but
it
yeah.
does. It does. Different disciplines look at things in different ways, which is one of the things that we'll find in this group, isn't it? And in healthcare, your study would be called a mixed method study.
Yeah.
Did you clarify it, categorize it that way as well in your,
Yes.
okay, thank you. Any other, Mary?
Thanks. And Kat, thanks so much. That was an absolutely wonderful, fascinating presentation. And I'm really in awe of your work. I think it's just great. And I love the way that you get it across in such a straightforward way. So even though you're doing quite complex analysis with these codes, it really was so clear. I'm really interested in the application of what you've found out in terms of student and staff practices. Because actually, quite a long time ago, I did some research into trying to see how students use feedback. And I used to get students to write a response to my feedback. So having gone through it, this is what I'm going to do, similar to what you have to do a point by point response if you submit to a journal, for example. And this is going back quite a few years at Brooks on our, whether it was Moodle then, I don't know. You used to have a facility for where you inserted comments, students could respond. And so I actually had that built in and I made use of it. Then they got rid of it, changed the whole interface with Turnitin and assignment submissions, so I couldn't do it. So sorry, I'm just explaining that because I sort of felt that was taken away from me and it wasn't a really easy way to replace it. How do you see a way that we could get students to engage and sort of communicate what they're going to do with the feedback back to particularly that angle I'm interested in, if you've got any suggestions.
Ah, that's so interesting. God. I mean, I suppose it's perhaps not super unusual, but it could be built into the assessment structure, I suppose, where, there's a kind of formative element where, you've got feedback and you make students tell you how they're going to apply it. Yeah, I'm afraid besides that, I don't really have any more interesting ideas about that. I suppose I would quite like to see, if I were doing it myself, I would quite like to see it being done in terms of my characterization. So, quite explicitly prompting students to basically, okay, give me some future applications for this feedback I'm giving you. And also, ideally, I would like to see them either at a process or a self-regulation focus. I would like to see it in those terms. But that's not really about how to do it. That's just more about what prompts to give. But yeah, I'm afraid I don't really have any more interesting things besides that, which I suspect you already know about. But yeah, I think it's a shame that they got rid of that function on
Mm.
Moodle because basically if I had that data, that could have been my whole PhD essentially. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Claire, I've got a question for Mary, but Claire, can we go to you first?
No, you can go ahead, Helen. It's fine.
Well, only Mary, I'm just curious how many students got back to you like that. Did a lot of them participate?
Yeah, they did.
Mm,
I mean, I suppose I couldn't enforce it, but I could encourage and really, if you set out the benefits. So I think one of our problems with feedback is often students not seeing the benefit of it. Like,
mm,
okay, well, they're going to write something about it, but so
mm,
what kind of thing.
definitely, yeah.
I think particularly something I didn't say, it was at a formative stage that I was doing this. So it was on drafts. So I was just trying to set up a sort of communication trail. I
Mm.
called it the ripple effect. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, thinking of my own kids at university, I would have been delighted if they'd engaged with their lecturer like that. It's such a positive thing to offer, isn't it? And to do. So, yeah, it just got me thinking. Claire.
Can I say something about that? Sorry, before Claire comes in. One of the other recommendations in my PhD was for staff to basically teach students, not in an overwrought way, but to just kind of tell students what they should be doing with their feedback. Because, certainly from what I can see, the sort of explicit conversations about what actually you should be doing with feedback don't really happen. Um, I could be wrong. Perhaps in your classrooms they are happening, but it could be as simple as saying to students, right, okay, you're going to get some assessment feedback, obviously. What ideally you would be doing is thinking about how you can use them to, identify what you're good at that you can continue doing or even improve, and also what things you could be doing better. So it's even just saying that sort of explicit thing might help. I don't know, because certainly when I was in uni, I never received, it was just sort of assumed that you would know what to do with feedback. We weren't really told. It was like, oh, obviously we get feedback, full stop. But yeah. Anyway, sorry,
And
Claire.
Claire, go on.
Um, Kat, hello from Singapore. Um,
Hello.
hey. I mean, I think I share echo everything that Mary said. I think it's absolutely brilliant. And listening to you speak just kind of sparked so many kind of thoughts and kind of questions. I mean, and just to come back to what you just said, I mean, I absolutely with my first years used to really work on, what are you going to do with this thing, with the feedback. And we also worked on not overwhelming students with feedback, which kind of almost speaks to your what's the purpose of all these little kind of comments that we're making, because and I boiled it down to something that my kids used to kind of get in their elementary school feedback, like 2 stars and a wish. So don't tell students everything that's okay and then like a 50 million point list of all the things that need to do better, because they won't engage. So let's just focus in on a few things that are workable and then work on them. And I really love the idea of the response, whether that's kind of working it through in a seminar to talk about maybe cohort generic feedback. So a lot of you made these kinds of errors. Here's what you can do with that. My question, because I'm turning into one of those people who rocks up at conferences and has a comment, not a question. My question is, have you tried, you were talking about how this might be useful to staff. How have you had that conversation with tutors? Because I would imagine in my experience, a lot of tutors would really love to kind of do more of this kind of stuff, but they're a little bit lost, or even just writing feedback is so time constrained that whatever I do, I've got to get it all done in that short period of time, and got to get it all uploaded and then do the mark sheets and everything. Because I would have thought that this kind of clarity about, well, think about the kinds of comments you're making and how they might land and what impact you think you want and whether the students understand that should be quite useful in helping us to be more effective, which of course is kind of the point. So my question is, have you tried having that conversation with people and how's it kind of gone down?
Sadly, I have not had that conversation with staff. But I suppose what I would say is that what you described, the two somethings and a wish. Sorry, I kind of missed that word there. But that's kind of, funnily enough, early on when I started this PhD, my partner, who was also kind of doing some teaching as a PhD student, and she kind of had to do, some assessments. And she asked, well, okay, what should I be doing with my students then? And I said, okay, I think you should, in your feedback, don't try and comment on everything. Give them three, like kind of, frame your bullet points in this way. Here are three things that I thought you did well that you should continue doing. Here are three things that you could be improving on for your next assignment. And so that was a very fast way to do it, bearing in mind people's enormous workloads. And it was, I think, evidence of impact, which is that she started doing it. And then her kind of I think it was a program lead noticed that she was doing it and then started saying to the other staff, everybody do your feedback in this way. So I think actually what you described, just kind of summarizing broad things and to make it digestible to students also helps you as a member of staff not having to comment on every single thing. I mean, I will admit when I am giving assessment feedback myself to undergraduate students, I do tend to want to comment on everything to make sure they've got it all. But I think certainly for somebody like me, I need to resist doing that. And yeah, giving kind of key things, which also helps make the feedback look more palatable, I suppose. Yeah. But
Yeah,
I'll be very interested to know about what people, I suppose, yeah, what you think,
yeah,
what
we
you
should
in this
bring you
room
in to
think.
talk to some. We should bring ask to talk to Mary. We should bring you in to talk to some people in the business school. And the other thing I used to get my students to do is I used to try and encourage them to do a kind of feedback audit. So have a look across everything you get at the end of it, on a particular results statement. There's the dog, 3 to 4 modules worth, Rebel, and identify, what are the things you're doing well, so do that again, and then what are is there a kind of something that's cropping up across multiple modules where there's something about structure or there's something about not using enough sources. It might be something really basic where you can go, you know what, I need to have that on my list so that I remember next time. Sorry about the dog.
Okay. Sorry, Helen, I think you had a comment and then possibly Nick's question.
No. I was just asking Nick. Who's had her hand up.
Yeah, thank you. So, Kat, obviously, this has been really helpful and interesting for people, and it's already sparked a discussion on things that people might do differently. So, I was wondering what you're planning to do next to kind of get your research out there.
Thank you, Nick, former line manager Nick. Well, I'm trying to sort of get some journal articles out. And yeah, oh dear. I mean, yeah, so I think I'm also still working on it. Basically, the background is that I got a bunch of corrections that I'm really not pleased by, and hopefully the external isn't in the network. Anyway, but I'm working through that. It was a bit traumatic, but I'm working through the corrections. I want to get my recommendations out for the Coventry staff who so kindly helped me to advertise the study. I still am working on that. The thing that also is relevant here that also actually it links back to what Claire said is that essentially there's a shift in thinking in how we do feedback in that it has what used to be a area of research focused on how staff should be giving the perfect feedback. Now what we should be doing is thinking about how to support students to be independent in using their feedback, eliciting feedback, being self-regulated learners, essentially. And so there's 2 parts of the question, I suppose, is how can we as staff, what practical things can we be doing to give better feedback, but also how can we be supporting students to make more use of their feedback? And in fact, one of the things that I talk about in my PhD is that students could be better, they could be supported to, sort of fully utilize the feedback information to sort of fully tap into the potential of the content of their feedback. So there is a thing here about also, it's not really about us providing feedback in a particular way. We also need to guide students to use their feedback in, I suppose, in more feedback literate ways, which, like the characterization and having that vocabulary can help with. But yeah, so, sorry, I'm not really sure how I got to this from your question, Nick. But yeah, I suppose, I would like to ideally have some recommendations, both for staff and students, which I am currently drafting for the Coventry people in the first instance. And I hope to have a version also for Brooks and maybe somewhere in a more public domain. But yeah, so that's my question. Journal articles and a sort of cheat sheet, a kind of practical guide.
Thank you very, very much. Louise, shall I hand over to you but thank you, Kat, once again, and thanks everybody, and I'll see you again soon.